When you think about vampires today, what probably comes to mind is that image of the handsome, seductive man who sparkles in the sun or lives in a gothic castle full of style. This modern vampire is almost a romance character, someone who sparks curiosity and even attraction. But this has nothing to do with what vampires represented in medieval Europe. The vampire of that time was not attractive. He was rotting, bloated, stinking, and absolutely terrifying. And the fear people felt about him was not fear of being seduced or losing emotional control. It was fear of dying. It was fear that someone you knew, someone from your own family, would come back from death to suck your life away. And this fear was not just a story told at night to scare children. It was something people really believed, something that shaped behaviors, that made entire communities dig up corpses and drive stakes through dead bodies. To understand why the vampire was the greatest fear of medieval Europe, you need to forget everything popular culture has taught you. You need to go back to a time when death was not something distant, but something that knocked on everyone's door with brutal frequency. Medieval Europe, especially between the 12th and 15th centuries, was a place where life expectancy barely passed 30 years, where epidemics swept through entire cities in a matter of weeks, where a simple infection could kill a healthy person in days. Death was everywhere, in the streets, in homes, in the fields, and people did not understand why this was happening. They had no knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or how diseases spread. What they had was religion, superstition, and a desperate need to make sense of the horror they were living through. When someone died from a contagious disease, let's say tuberculosis, the entire family often got sick shortly after. Imagine the scene. A father dies coughing blood, wasting away over months. He is buried. Weeks later, the daughter starts showing the same symptoms. Then the son, then the mother. From the perspective of someone who knows nothing about disease transmission, what is happening there? The explanation that made sense in that context was that the dead person was coming back during the night and sucking the life from the living. He was feeding on his family. And the more people died, the stronger the belief became that the first dead person was a vampire. But there was more. When you bury a body, it goes through a decomposition process. And this process, for someone who does not understand biology, looks extremely disturbing and supernatural. The body swells because of internal gases. The skin can become pinker or redder in certain areas. Hair and nails appear to grow because the skin retracts. Blood can come out of the mouth and nose. And if the body was buried in a wooden coffin, the chest may look less sunken, giving the impression that there is still breathing. If you open a tomb weeks after burial and see a body like this, that looks fatter, redder, with blood dripping and with longer nails, what do you think? That the body is not dead, that it is feeding on something. And that was exactly what people did. They dug up the dead. This was common. When a community started suffering from unexplained deaths, local leaders, usually with support from the church, ordered graves to be opened. They looked for signs of vampirism. And when they found a body that was not decomposed in the expected way, they took action. The most famous was driving a wooden stake through the corpse's heart. But it was not just that. Sometimes they cut off the head. Sometimes they filled the mouth with garlic or stones. Sometimes they burned the entire body. All of this to ensure that the dead person would not come back again. The fear of the vampire was different from other medieval fears because it was personal. You were not afraid of an abstract demon coming from hell. You were afraid of your uncle, your wife, your neighbor. The vampire was someone you knew, someone who had lived in the same house as you, eaten at the same table, slept in the same room. And now this person was coming back, not as themselves, but as something corrupted and evil, to destroy you and everyone you loved. This messed with social structure in a way that other fears did not, because it created distrust within the family itself. It created the idea that death was not the end, but potentially the beginning of something much worse. And there is another point that is fundamental. Medieval Europe was deeply Christian. The Catholic Church dominated almost every aspect of life. And in medieval Christianity, death had a very specific meaning. When you died, your soul went to heaven, to purgatory, or to hell, depending on how you had lived. The body stayed on earth, waiting for the day of final judgment. But the vampire broke this order. He was a body that refused to accept death. a body that remained trapped on Earth, acting against God's will. This was not just scary. It was blasphemy. It was a direct affront to divine order. And in a society where religion was everything, where the fear of hell was real and constant, the idea that a dead person could be trapped between worlds, neither alive nor dead, was absolutely disturbing. Let's talk now about a real case. In 12th century Serbia, there are records of a man named Petar Blagojevic. He died and was buried. 10 days later, he supposedly appeared at the homes of several neighbors during the night. These people reported that Petar entered their rooms, sat on their chests, and suffocated them. In less than a week, 9 people died. The community panicked. They went to the local authorities and demanded that Petar's body be exhumed. When they opened the tomb, they found the body without clear signs of decomposition. There was fresh blood in the mouth. The skin was reddish. The nails had grown. For them, this was sufficient proof. They drove a stake through his heart, and the body immediately bled, which was interpreted as confirmation that he was a vampire. After that, they burned the corpse. This case is not isolated. There are hundreds of similar records throughout Eastern Europe, especially in the Balkans. And what all these stories have in common is the desperation of the people. They were not making these things up for fun. They were trying to survive. They were trying to protect their families from something they could not explain any other way. And when you live in a time where modern medicine does not exist, where the scientific method does not exist, where all you have are the explanations that tradition and the church give you, you do what seems logical. You act based on what you believe to be real. Now, let's connect this to the present. The fear of the medieval vampire has not disappeared. It just changed form. Today, nobody digs up corpses looking for vampires. But the essence of that fear remains alive. It is the fear that something invisible is draining you. Except today, it is not an undead person sucking your blood. It is the algorithm sucking your attention. It is work sucking your energy. It is anxiety sucking your peace. The modern vampire does not have fangs. It has notifications. It has deadlines. It has likes and comments and messages that never stop coming. Think about it this way. You wake up in the morning, and the first thing you do is grab your phone. Before you even get out of bed, you're already giving part of your energy to the screen. You scroll the feed. You see people living apparently perfect lives. You feel that pang of inadequacy. You feel like you are falling behind. And then you spend the rest of the day trying to compensate. Posting, responding, liking, trying to stay relevant. And at the end of the day, you are exhausted. But exhausted from what? You did not do anything physically draining. You did not run, did not lift weights, did not work in the sun. But something drained you. Something invisible sucked your vitality, and you did not even really notice how it happened. This is the same dynamic as the medieval vampire. The difference is that now the vampire is not an external creature. It is embedded in the systems we created, in the platforms we use, in the behavior patterns we adopt without questioning. And just as people in medieval Europe did not understand that tuberculosis was caused by bacteria, many people today do not understand that constant emotional exhaustion is caused by the way we organize our lives. They just feel that something is wrong, that they are being drained, and they try to compensate in ways that do not solve anything. They buy things. They do therapy without changing habits. They take anxiety medication while continuing to expose their minds to the same stimuli that cause the anxiety. The medieval vampire was feared because he attacked at night, when you were vulnerable. The modern vampire does exactly the same thing, except now the night is any moment of weakness. It is when you are bored and grab your phone. It is when you are sad and seek validation online. It is when you are insecure and start comparing yourself to other people. The attack is subtle. You do not feel physical pain, but gradually, you lose the ability to be present. You lose the ability to feel satisfaction with simple things. You need increasingly larger doses of stimulation to feel anything. And there's another interesting parallel. In medieval Europe, it was believed that vampires were created in specific ways. Someone who died violently, someone who had not been buried properly, someone who had lived a life of sin. The idea was that certain conditions made a person vulnerable to becoming a vampire. Today, we see something similar with addiction. Certain people, under certain conditions, are more prone to developing dependence on technology, on social media, on pornography, on games. Not everyone picks up their phone and loses 3 hours without noticing, but many people do, and these people often have something in common: loneliness, lack of purpose, trauma, existential emptiness. These are conditions that make them vulnerable. Another crucial aspect of medieval fear was the idea of contagion. A vampire created other vampires. If he killed you, you also became one. This created a cycle of horror that could devastate an entire community. And again, look at how this manifests today. Destructive behaviors are contagious. Anxiety is contagious. If you spend time with people who are constantly stressed, you become stressed. If you follow profiles that promote impossible beauty standards, you start internalizing those standards. If you consume angry content, you become angrier. The vampire no longer needs to bite your neck. He just needs you to watch his videos, read his posts, absorb his energy. And let's be honest about one thing. People in medieval Europe tried to protect themselves from vampires with religious symbols: crucifixes, holy water, garlic, wooden stakes. These were methods that, obviously, did not work against the real causes of diseases, but they made people feel safe. They gave the sensation control over something uncontrollable. Today, we do the same thing. We use productivity apps to manage time. We do a 1-week digital detox and return to the same habits. We buy self-help books. We follow wellness gurus. And deep down, none of this solves a real problem, which is the way we structure entire society around systems that drain us. The medieval vampire also represented the fear of death that does not respect rules, death that does not warn, death that takes even the young and healthy. And this fear exists to this day, just in another form. It is the fear that your life is passing, and you are not really living. It is a fear of reaching 40, 50 years old, and realizing you spent decades just surviving, working, fulfilling obligations, without ever having done anything that really mattered to you. This fear is as real as the fear a medieval peasant felt when seeing his neighbor die from mysterious disease. But there is an important difference. The people of medieval Europe knew they were afraid. They spoke openly about vampires, about demons, about death. Today, we live in a society that tries to hide fear, that tries to convince you that everything is fine, that you just need to work more, produce more, consume more. Fear becomes repressed. It turns into diffuse anxiety. It turns into depression. It turns into the sense of emptiness that so many people feel but cannot name. And here is something worth thinking about. Medieval vampires were familiar, dead people. People you knew. This made the fear deeper because it broke the security of home. Today, what drains us most often comes from within our own circles. It is family expectations, demands from friends, comparisons with co-workers, pressure to maintain an image on social media. The danger does not come from outside. It comes from within the social system we built and that now consumes us. Another fascinating point is how authorities dealt with the fear of vampires. The church, which had immense power, used this fear to maintain control. If you did not follow the rules, if you did not live according to religious precepts, you risked becoming a vampire after death. This kept people in line. Today, control is exercised differently, but still through fear. Fear of not having enough money, fear of not being accepted, fear of becoming irrelevant. And modern institutions, whether corporations or digital platforms, use these fears to shape behavior. Think about how social media works. They do not force you to use them. They just create an environment where, if you do not use them, you are left out. You lose connections. You lose opportunities. You become invisible. It is a type of collective vampirism. The platform sucks time and attention from everyone, and everyone accepts it because they are afraid of being alone. It is exactly the same mechanism that made entire medieval villages participate in vampire exorcism rituals. Collective fear leads to collective behavior, even when that behavior does not make rational sense. Let's go back a bit to the question of death itself. Why was death so central to the fear of vampires? Because death was the only certainty those people had. Everyone died. Children died. Young people died. And death was often horrible, painful, slow, and after death, there was divine judgment. The idea that a dead person could be trapped on earth, unable to go to heaven or hell, unable to rest, was terrifying because it meant eternal suffering. Today, we exchange physical death for a kind of death in life. People who spend entire years just existing, without really living, working at jobs they hate, maintaining relationships that do not work, following routines that bring no satisfaction whatsoever. And when you ask why they continue, the answer usually involves fear. Fear of change, fear of instability, fear that trying something different will be worse. So, why were vampires the greatest fear of medieval Europe? Because they represented everything that was uncontrollable and incomprehensible at that time. They represented the disease that killed without warning. They represented death that did not follow the rules. They represented the possibility that someone you loved could become your destroyer. They represented the fear that not even death would bring peace. And all of this in a context where people did not have the tools to understand what was really happening. What does this tell us about human fear in general? That we always fear what we do not understand. That we create narratives to make sense of chaos. And that these narratives, no matter how absurd they may seem to an outsider, are absolutely real to those who live them. The peasants who dug up bodies and drove stakes were not stupid. They were doing the best they could with the information and tools they had. Similarly, people today who destroy their own mental health consuming toxic content are not weak. They are navigating a world that changed too fast, using instincts that were developed for a completely different type of life. The medieval vampire teaches us that fear can make entire communities act in extreme ways. It can make people violate tombs. It can make families turn against each other. And the modern vampire, this one that lives in our habits and systems, teaches us that we remain vulnerable. We remain drained. We remain looking for symbolic wooden stakes to drive into the heart of something we can barely define. The difference is that now we have more knowledge, more resources, more capacity to understand what is happening. But even so, many people choose not to look. They choose to continue living as if everything is fine, even while feeling that something is sucking the life out of them little by little. And perhaps the scariest thing is realizing that, in the end, the vampire was always real. It just was never the creature we imagined. It was always the way we organize life, the structures we create, the fears we carry. The vampire is real because the draining is real. The exhaustion is real. The feeling of just surviving instead of living is real. Medieval Europe had its epidemics and its dead who did not rest. We have our epidemics of anxiety and our living who are never present. The name changed, but the horror remains the same.